This week, a look at Carl Barks, who anonymously wrote and drew many Donald Duck comic books from 1942 to 1966, and created Scrooge McDuck and other Disney characters. Were these comics meant as satire or social commentary, or just entertainment? In this flashback episode from June 3rd, 2013, Tom Spurgeon joins Kumar and me in discussing the best of the comic book duck artists. First, as always, I'd like to thank our patrons for helping to keep the show going. You can pitch in by pledging at least $2 a month at patreon.com/deconcomics.
This is Tim.
And this is Kumar.
And this is Tom.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo with Kumar in Melbourne and Tom Spurgeon of comicsreporter.com in New Mexico. We haven't all three been on together in a while. I can't remember what the last time was, but this time we're talking about Donald Duck. Specifically, Carl Barks' work on Donald Duck way back in the mid-20th century, and specifically the Fantagraphics volume Lost in the Andes, which of course is named after one of the stories in the book, but we'll get into all that. But I guess to get started, I was thinking, Carl Barks is kind of a weird figure because at the time that he was actively doing this, nobody knew who he was, because they were all the stories were just credited to Walt Disney. And people who read these comics a lot, I guess, they could tell his work from the others because he was the good one, or at least considered better than the other people who worked on the Donald Duck stuff. But nobody knew the name Carl Barks really until after he quit doing them, I guess. So it's kind of odd that he was not, that his work was more famous than he was for a long time.
Is that right? It's not until after he retired that
was what I thought I got from the notes.
It was near the end. I don't, because he had kind of a stranger later career in that, he did. I think it was the early 1960s when they finally found out who he was. But of course, back then there wouldn't have been an announcement. It just kind of would have spread out through, letter writing circles and stuff like that. So it's not like even the figuring out who it was would have been communicated. But as I recall, Bart's late career, even the comics, he kind of stopped writing and drawing at a certain point in the late 60s, and then into the 70s he did some writing for Chase Craig, who is the editor's name. Like, he did the Junior Woodchuck stories. So he kind of, it wasn't one of those grand finales. There wasn't like a grand finale to his career. So he was around after he was kind of a known quantity, and he transitioned with that fan boost first, just initially for the creation of a market for it, and then by having people advocate on his behalf with Disney to allow him to do this. What he did, he's well known for like a series of paintings featuring famous scenes from his comics, such as Scrooge burrowing, swimming through his coins, and other kind of, probably Lost in the Andes and other famous stories he's seen. So he actually had a kind of second lucrative career as a painter of Disney duck imagery, which is kind of an odd thing. Yeah, and the whole legend, as you mentioned, he has this kind of legend that's grown about him as kind of the good duck artist, or the duck man was kind of what they called him back in the day, when they could tell his work from other work. And I don't think we can always take that for granted. And I think it's kind of a sign of how ubiquitous Duck comics were, and Disney comics were, and kind of funny animal comics were at one point in the American mid-20th century, that you could make these subtle distinctions. It's kind of like, we grew up, I imagine that all three of us kind of grew up with superhero comics. So I grew up with superhero comics anyway. And whereas my mom or one of my friends that didn't read superhero comics, that stuff would kind of look alike to them, a Jack Kirby and a Rich Buckler, or a Sal Buscema and a John Buscema might look exactly the same. I could always tell, difference between inkers on various cartoonists. What Jack Kirby looked like when he was inked by Vince Colletta as opposed to someone else. And I think it just goes to show you how many people were reading Duck Comics and how many people were paying attention to Disney Comics, that you could, even though they weren't signed and even though they did kind of all adhere to this look, this studio look, that you could tell the difference, the subtle differences in storytelling and the general quality of Barks' work. And I think that, one of the great correctives we're going to see over the next 10, 15 years, I think we're going to see a lot more history of comics that kind of take this non-superhero view into account. So, yeah, that's the legend of Karl Barks. Karl Barks was the man that kind of fandom recovered from anonymity, which is not only a kind of a cool legend, but it's the best kind of legend in that it's self-congratulatory. So, like, the people that tell it kind of get to clap themselves on the back as they tell it. It's a good thing fandom did to kind of make a reputation for Mr. Barks and to allow him a second career as he got older, as a painter and kind of fan favorite for the last few decades of his life.
Yeah. So he was doing these Duck Comics from 1942 to 66, I guess. But I think in the 70s, when I was growing up, and I read, like, the Gold Key was publishing Walt Disney Comics and Stories, and I think they must have been reprinting Bark stuff. I mean, I wouldn't have known from whatever at the time, but I'm guessing I must have been reading Bark stuff in that comic.
You would have been reading in digests and reprints, for sure.
Yeah. So in this volume, Lost in the Andes, which I guess is supposed to be Volume 5, but oddly they didn't put a volume number on it anywhere.
Yeah, I thought it was Volume 7.
It's 7.
It's 7,
I
okay.
think so. And no, they did not.
And if you want to know what years these comics came out, you have to look on the very last page in tiny type. These are from between December 1948 and August 1949.
Right.
And I read some different reviews online where some were like, okay, it's fine that within that book, they kind of shuffled the order of them, and others thought that was terrible. Just within the book, they're not in chronological order.
Well,
right.
First of all, can we talk about the craziness of it being the first volume and them numbering it number 7?
Okay.
Because the logic, I guess, was that they would put the best stuff out first. So they're like, let's start with Volume 7 because that's the best stuff. But doesn't that just mean that the sales are they're just going to be kicking themselves when they get to, like, the end? I mean, the worst stuff is going to come last, I guess, according to the publishing plan.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like two different strategies. Whether or not do you start with kind of a high note, or do you end the stuff with which people are familiar, or do you start with the early material? And I think it comes down to gauging, what kind of the interest is, or where the interest is with that material, and what the licensing partner wants. I mean, you can contrast this with what Fantagraphics did with the Complete Peanuts material, which was, they were kind of interested in having all the material out there, and there was a high degree of interest in kind of seeing a lot of the early strips that hadn't been seen in a while, or only seen in kind of, some of which were only seen in kind of these haphazard, collections, these paperback collections that were done back then. So I think there was a high degree of interest in kind of rediscovering Peanuts, and I just think that the desire for Disney to kind of have a book that they could sell in stores and kind of move into bookshelves was communicated to Fantagraphics likely differently than the Schultz people's interests. And so, you make your choices and you take your shot, I guess. And the period this is kind of the beginning period where Barks went on this crazy run of character creation too, and we're not just the stories were really kind of interesting, but he started to introduce the characters by which he's best known, because we think in terms of intellectual property now, so a lot of creators are better known for the characters they create than the stories they tell. And by this time Scrooge was in there, and Gladstone Gander would have been in there. But we still had, like, the Beagle Boys to come. We still had the Junior Woodchucks to come. There's still a lot of that character creation to come. So, there's a lot, I guess it's just kind of, you take your choices and you go for it. It would have been weirder than, I think, to play up that Volume 7 if they had, going with this strategy might just baffled people. But, maybe a standalone volumes this work. Who knows? Disney's kind of impenetrable to me, how people consume that material. So who knows?
I always wondered as a kid growing up why the stories were always Donald and not Mickey or some of the other characters. I mean, Donald was okay, but I would like to read some Mickey Mouse stories, and I don't know that Barks ever did any.
That's a good question. I'm not sure if he did or not. I'm not exactly the super. I would assume he did. And there certainly were plenty of Mickey-type stories. Mickey's more of an everyman and not so much. His corporate image changed. Donald kind of got to be cooler because he was not kind of the spokesperson for the whole company. They are doing reprints of the newspaper strip, the Mickey Mouse newspaper strip that Floyd Gottfredson did, and those are pretty interesting because they're really like young people's strip. It's a young cartoonist, and he's just throwing everything out there, and they're really kind of pulpy and weird. And Mickey's packing heat, and running around and getting in fist fights all the time, and he's kind of like a poor corporate symbol, It's like, Mickey, when I was growing up, I don't know, he was kind of like in a pantsuit and was a dude with a big head, and he'd kind of wave a lot from various parks. And for him to be out there, like kicking ass and beating on people, and shooting at them and, having adventures was kind of a weird thing. I'm not that familiar with the comic book stuff that featured Mickey. But I don't know, maybe Barks had a special talent for the ducks, and other people had different talents elsewhere. There's certainly been a number of Mickey stuff, but yeah, why Barks got the duck gig, if that was how much that was self-directed and how much that was editors kind of deciding what each guy was good at, I'm not really sure. We certainly got a lot of good comics out of Barks this way, so I'd love to question it.
Yeah, true. And it was interesting to read in the bio material in the front how, as Barks was putting out his best work, his personal life was kind of hell. He went through 2 bad marriages, and he was just he was making these comics to escape from all that, he said, I believe.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting how adversity can bring out the best creative work sometimes.
Yeah, it's something he has in common with, Charles Schulz, who didn't have a happy marriage for, the initial burst of Peanuts. It's not an uncommon thing for cartoonists to have lousy marriages, even great ones, for sure. But yeah, no, that stuff is interesting. And, one of the things I think that distinguishes these volumes is that there is kind of a rich tradition of super rigorous Disney scholarship, scholars out there that kind of, want to write about these issues and know, like, this stuff backwards and forwards and know, like, exactly what was going on and, almost down to, like, what the dude was wearing, like what he drew certain stories. It's kind of scary. I remember I went to a school down south and got a history degree. I remember, like, they always said, like, if you go down south, the one class you couldn't take in a southern university was a Civil War class because those guys would just know their stuff backwards and forwards, and there was no way to fake your way out of an essay in a Civil War class down south. And that's kind of like what duck scholars are like. They're like the most like hardcore of the general class of writers about comics. I think those guys are really like text conscious and know their stuff. So the sporting material, I think, has been really great so far.
Do we know if Barks was treated well by Disney, or is this one of those sad comic book stories?
I think, he's treated well enough to make a living, and make a good living, and he was kind of left alone to do his story. I don't think he was editorially interfered with. I think, as much as comic book gigs were good gigs in any way, that was a pretty good gig. He was kept anonymous, of course, as Tim mentioned, so I'm not sure how important that was to him even. And he certainly had to struggle later on to kind of get the dispensation to do the licensed stuff that he did, the paintings and stuff. But I think, overall that they've been pretty good about kind of embracing him, and certainly like putting the library out and kind of calling it the Karl Barks Library is kind of a model for kind of recognizing, the Disney, these kind of Disney contributors in a way that I wish some of the mainstream comic book companies would do with their superhero characters. And Disney has that tradition, like they have, how many old men, like the animators, they kind of have this, the grand old men of Disney animation and all these, these core animators that did all their stuff in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And they've actually been able to make money on, and kind of presenting to hardcore fans, that these are, these creators. It's kind of like creating a different level of interest. So I think in terms of comics, I think it's, there wasn't a lot of sadness to that story. Whether or not it was an extraordinary way to make a living or whatever, I'm not sure, but it seemed like a reasonably comfortable life, and he didn't seem too bitter or angry about it. I've never heard of anything like that. So Chase Craig was supposedly a nice man to work for, I guess. So seems like a pretty good story. There's not a, there's no subtext of, the horrors of working with, there's no funky flashman in later issues of Uncle Scrooge or something. Even though I guess, you could go back and read that to see if there's a little Walt Disney and Scrooge McDuck. That would be kind of interesting. I don't know. I think it's pretty good. I don't know.
I asked because, recently this Don Rosa stuff has come out where he's sounds angry a lot of stuff, and I'm just wondering if it was like that for Barks or whether he had it better or,
But, and I think, it was probably just as rigorous. I imagine that Barks had fewer expectations in that, in that regard, that he just was a guy that wanted to make a living and wanted to do comics and, was kind of seen as an exception later on, whereas Don kind of grew up with those, expectations that you're treated a little better and, that there's some, and they also traded on his name in a way that they didn't trade on Barks' name until much later on. So whether or not that was it's a very interesting question. Don is kind of the exemplar of all the guys that came after Barks in terms of being very Barks-centric in terms of his creativity. And, doing his work's almost like riffs or remixes of a lot of Barks' greatest comics. But you're right, he's been dissatisfied in a way that I never got from Barks, and whether that's generational or whether that's a permutation of modern Disney policy, I couldn't tell you. I don't know Don I only know Don to say hi, and I'm not really familiar with anything about his complaints other than what he's written. And that might just be, specific to the frustrations he's feeling right now at this point in his career. I'm not real sure. But that's a good point. It's not always a happy thing working for a giant mega corporation like Disney. But as far as, gigs, as far as assignments, as far as jobs, it doesn't seem like Barks was a particularly sad story. But maybe that's just because of the reduced expectations that a man of his generation would bring to it.
Yeah, I guess it was not uncommon I guess most comic book creators at the time were anonymous, weren't they?
Yeah, sure, for sure. Yeah, there was some signing of comic stories, but nothing. And and guys within that industry were would be known kind of as would be known quantities, or editors would go after certain guys for the effect of their work, but certainly not in an authorial sense, or kind of as an author. You weren't kind of presented that way until the 60s and 70s and beyond. Even though, Barks could have been, because he certainly had the distinctive, there was a distinctive quality to his work on which they could have built, but it just wasn't done at that time.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, the stories in here are from a set time period, but they're not in the book in chronological order, and part of the reason for that is that they've broken them up into the longer, 20-ish page adventures, and then the 10-page comedy strips that are kind of like, the subject matter is similar to what you'd see in the short cartoons that they would run in the movie theater before the feature, or like a Bugs Bunny cartoon or something. And then there are some one-page gag strips, so they've broken it down that way. So, yeah, how do we get into talking about
Well, one note to make is that a lot of people, because of Uncle Scrooge's kind of singular creation by Barks and kind of the way he's been a dominant character, and kind of all the characters that he created, a lot of people, at least my age, kind of assumed that the Uncle Scrooge stories, or the Scrooge McDuck stories, were the main thing for which Barks is known. And there's actually a lot of discussion over what stories of Barks are the best. And I know when we did the Comics Journal Top 100 issue, Kim Thompson, who was kind of our office's resident duck expert, and as the former master of Critters, the great anthology of the 80s, was a funny animal guy in general. And he was very insistent that the good stuff, the really good Barks stuff, or the really remarkable Barks stuff, was the short work and the Donald Duck stories, and how those kind of transformed into these adventure stories. And the Scrooge McDuck stuff that we kind of think of from later on was, kind of a, secondary, still great comics, still top 25 comics, but not the kind of Donald Duck hardcore, like these comedic little sweets and these slightly longer adventure stories. So one nice thing about this series is that we're gonna get like a better appraisal maybe of the Donald Duck portion of the Duck output that Barks made.
Yeah,
we get a bunch of shorts, and we get some longer stories here, and we get Lost in the Andes, which was a favorite story of Barks's. So,
but yeah, I think it's a perfect comic, Lost in the Andes.
How so?
It's just a perfectly constructed diamond of a comic. Like, even things like the kids show up and they start blowing this bubble gum, and it's just this hilarious, cute thing. But then he finds a way to make that part of like a critical plot device later on. You don't really see it coming, and it just rolls along. There's like 2 gags in every panel, and I like that kind of underhanded jabs at bureaucracy and stuff like that. I just thought it was genius.
Yeah.
Through and through.
Kumar, I think you're onto something. That's the great thing that Barks did, was he kind of took these apparent elements, these kind of gag elements, these natural the easy style, or the ease with which those characters could be like comedic and have a little scene work and have these little moments. But then he had this kind of compulsive way to put these narratives together. Like, everything is about story. Everything is kind of like these building kind of crazy narratives where something that is kind of a throwaway becomes part of this wider story, moves into something else. It's this happened, which we think of. It seems kind of absurd, but it's not something that comics did a lot of at that time. Didn't tell these stories. They're kind of like packed with plot development, and kind of there's just a lot of stuff happening. And even as a kid, when I would read these Barks stories, they were just incredible. Like, there's just all this stuff going on. There was always this kind of attention to story and attention to kind of pushing everything forward, and they're always very satisfying experiences that way. And then I think you also nail like the third leg of it, which is that he had a really easy and subtle hand with kind of pointing out these satirical there's just satirical asides, these kind of deconstructions of everything from, the farm, there's kind of the farm culture versus city culture, to the job market, to, ambition, kind of this American ambition, to these kind of travel narratives and the kind of funny kind of biases that you bring to these travel narratives. There's always these subtle, kind of poking at American structures and American views of things that I think has made that stuff kind of last in a way that they might not have if they hadn't had those elements. So good work there, Kumar. You just kind of nailed it right there. 1, 2, 3. Gag, story, satire. Boom, boom, boom. Bark. In your face. Eat it, everybody. Thank you and good night.
In the notes in the back, there are several different writers who were commenting on the stories in the book, and Stefano Prierone, if I'm pronouncing that right, he interprets this Lost in the Andes as having a lot to do with conformism. And he cites the example of how the Huey, Dewey, and Louie cook some of these square eggs, and Donald tastes them, thinks they're terrible, but thinks somebody else is probably going to like them, and he passes them on to some. They kind of go up the chain of command with each person saying, "Well, these taste terrible, but the person above me is probably going to like them," and then they're all just kind of sticking with what they think they're supposed to do, and then they all get sick from the eggs. So,
right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess some of these comments in the back, I wondered if they were kind of over-interpreting, but I can see his point here about the conformism thing, and he sees that as a theme that runs through the story with the square eggs and everything.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know, that is kind of a central question to work like this, whether or not it's actually how much intent there is to kind of present satire, or whether or not this kind of, because these guys weren't brooding, guys like Barks weren't brooding over their stories, weren't like, brewing up these intricate concoctions of blending satire and narrative. They're just kind of pumping it out. And you don't know how much there was an intent to kind of play with these elements, if that entered into it, or if it's just the fact that you're kind of operating on a level in which, you subconsciously you do these things, or even just the appropriateness of certain setups, of certain things that, Barks might have found interesting. Like there's a lot of, because, he's a farm guy. Like, for instance, he was a farm guy. So there's always these elements of farm culture that kind of work their way into these stories. And in fact, a lot of funny animal artists, a lot of cartoon artists that worked in both animation and comic books were kind of these a lot of times they were small town guys that kind of transitioned to the big city. So you find like a lot of farm jokes, a lot of strange farms in the middle of these imaginary towns, and a lot of, animals and stuff. I mean, even just Lost in the Andes, it's kind of a fairy tale based on the legend of square eggs that you would hear about on the farm when you're a kid. So, how much of what ends up, being, is it a comment on conformism because Barks intended it that way, or if it's just, he puts these elements into place to construct a gag, and they just kind of pull this meaning in after them. I mean, I don't know, and I'm not sure we can ever really know, how much is intended.
I can think of another great example of that is the on the very first page. There's you see a museum display case, and it's got two labels. One is a rock, and another rock, and that cracked me up. And I'm sure it was just like a gag, and I'm sure it probably cracked him up when he wrote it. But it has a kind of unintentional comment on museum culture somehow.
Yeah. No, that's a great, really easy example. And like you said, I'm sure that it was, on many levels, it was just a gag. But at the same time, if you look at things with that kind of clarity of vision, you can it does kind of drag in, all of those elements too. It does drag in those critical elements. It just kind of, if you have a character that's kind of fully developed and weird and idiosyncratic as Scrooge McDuck, it's going to end up being a comment on capitalist culture, whether you like it or not, just because you're just putting so many elements into play, so many kind of comedic, weird, kind of very specific story choices into play. So
some of the stuff with Scrooge, too, I mean, the subject matter almost felt like it was out of like a Ted Rall cartoon or something, the capitalists and chasing the natives off of their own land to mine it or something, and I guess Barks is supposedly a conservative guy, but the stories come off kind of progressive.
They do, and and kind of like that element to them, Tim, is kind of something that is, kind of those people that take comics very seriously and kind of use this overriding criticism of a lot of North American comics and even a lot of European comics, and kind of really do see a lot of them as kind of junk expressions of like really simplistic ideas. Like Barks has kind of stayed from that a little bit because of elements like that, kind of like this overriding critique of capitalist excess that kind of comes out with Scrooge McDuck, and to a lesser extent, this kind of secondary critique of American can-do qualities that Donald Duck kind of incorporates. Especially when played against Gladstone Gander, the lucky goofball, lazy guy. So those elements, he's kind of writing about big issues, and I think that he always got a pass, especially from Europeans that kind of saw that as a way to appreciate those comics. In a way, even something like Tintin isn't appreciated by those same kind of critics, because there aren't those kind of there isn't that kind of critical element to it that kind of you can suss out or kind of cook out of the other parts of it. So it has really changed the critical reputation of those comics, and they're kind of it's fun to engage with as an adult, for sure. Mm-hmm.
Coming up, Barks' depictions of African and Polynesian natives, stereotypes and yet not. Barks' storytelling integrity, he doesn't cheat. Controversies about the coloring. How modern problems are anticipated in these 1949 comics, and more.
This podcast is part of the Deconstructing Comics Network, where we're grateful to our supporters on Patreon. Patrons get exclusive extra content. Pledge $2 a month or more and get Batman 66 podcast Bat Bits, where we're discussing correspondence from writer and script editor Lorenzo Semple to producer William Dozier about his concept for Batman 66, and a 1967 TV Guide write-up of Yvonne Craig entering the show as Batgirl. At $4 a month, you also get our monthly show Silver Age Batman, where I'm moving through the book Batman in the 50s issue by issue, discussing each story and sometimes laughing at them, with a rotating second chair of Paul, Emmett, Patrick, or Kumar. Follow our Patreon for free, and you can hear the first 2 episodes of both Bat Bits and Silver Age Batman for free. Check it out at patreon.com/deconcomics, and thanks for your support.
I wanted to talk a little more about there are several stories in here where there are natives. It's in a Polynesian setting or African setting, and of course, the cartoons and comics and whatever of this time period, there are a lot of stereotypes that look really racist to us now, and yeah. Sometimes these native characters visually will fit the stereotypes of the time, or African American characters pop up in one story, but at the same time, he usually treats them very respectfully, and if they have grievances against white Americans with beaks and feathers, they're legitimate grievances, like the guys that Scrooge scared off their land, or Gladstone Gander is on that Polynesian island and eats them out of house and home. So even if they're sort of treated as villains, like in the Africa story, at the same time, you're not quite sure who to root for, because they're right to be angry at Scrooge.
Right, for sure. And I was kind of surprised that they did. That was one of the reasons I was surprised that was the only surprising thing about the first volume when I looked at it as a volume of just comics, was there was kind of like this barrage of unflattering, unfortunate stereotypes. But you're right in that the material itself, for whatever those kind of visual depictions are kind of troubling and vomitous, even, that there is kind of a subtle play against it. It is kind of a flattering picture of Barks, but it's kind of hard when you take the weight of all of these depictions to not think that he was at least kind of self-aware and kind of aware of these things at play. I don't think that's a lot of happy accidents if he didn't have some self-awareness about like how these stereotypes kind of came across on the page. So yeah, you're right, and that it's not. The depictions themselves are a little bit more complex than the visual iconography used would have you believe, and that's kind of a welcome relief when you're reading this material, because it's only sort of depressing instead of all the way depressing to read these. Yeah. depiction. So.
Yeah, I had exactly the same reaction because the zombie that shows up actually is a very deliberately sympathetic character. He's kind of the one you're rooting for, and but the odd thing is, like, a lot of the black characters seem to be human instead of animals. That struck me as really, I don't know, it's very strange. I don't think there were any other humans around.
Yeah, certainly those Polynesian characters. I mean, they don't even have the black noses that most of the other non-duck characters have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with Disney iconography generally to know how rare that might be or how that reflects kind of the animated portion of it. I'm not really, but I think you're right in that it's probably distinctive. Sure. What the hell that means, I couldn't tell you. I'll have to go back and jump in the Wayback Machine and figure that out. Kind of go shake Carl up in his Oregon home or whatever. Until
well, and that white guy, the professor who had been shrunk, he also doesn't have a black. I mean, he's completely human. But I think as you get into the later ones, like the ones that I read reprinted by Gold Key in the 70s, that must have been later than this. It seemed like everybody who wasn't a duck had a black nose. They were dogs or something. That always bothered me. I couldn't really tell what kind of animal they were supposed to be. They looked like humans with black noses. But yeah, I think maybe Barks is still kind of developing that here. And some characters do end up being completely human. I think we pondered like the kind of weird collection of how funny animals are portrayed in these books. With the kind of this explosion of different duck types. Like ducks are the most varied kind of creatures on the entire planet, and the others kind of are all lumped together in this kind of generic animal form. We probably go mad. It would probably be, it's like it's kind of, there are creepy elements to that, kind of lazy elements to that iconography that I think are kind of interesting for sure. Yeah, well, and then a bunch of regular animals show up in one of the stories too, the pet story. There's a goat and an owl and stuff, and
I wrote a funny animal strip for like 3 years for a newspaper strip, and I remember, like my natural tendency was always to write jokes about them eating each other, and I remember I got a note back from my editor at one point, Jay Kennedy, the late Jay Kennedy, and he wrote back in big letters on a strip that we had submitted that said, "Cannibalism is never funny." That was which I disagree with. I think cannibalism is frequently funny, but I kind of got his point. But yeah, it's just weird, like what do the ducks eat on Thanksgiving? It seems like they eat turkey, and that's just really creepy. Who knows?
Well, I guess Barks thought of the ducks as being humans who just looked like ducks or something. He treated them as human, and Scrooge is the richest man in the world, according to the dialogue.
That's right.
Not the richest duck.
That might be a good seg into the art as well, because the way he draws them is the body language is amazing. It's just really effortless and kind of really human, and you don't even really think about them as ducks anyway.
Yeah, I don't know. What was the first part of that, Kumar? I kind of lost you there.
I just think the body language and the kind of the gestures, the way he draws them is really effortless, and it flows so smoothly that you just kind of forget that they're ducks, and you forget that the three kids are identical. Like,
yeah,
there's all sorts of stuff that just kind of the art just carries it in such a way that so much of the stuff doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, they are kind of expressive figures, and it's really kind of interesting. I mean, even by this point, he had done so many comics that a lot of this stuff came really naturally to him. I always find the staging of these comics really interesting, and that he kind of, there's no cheating. There's no, it's kind of, you kind of get the sense of a room, and he doesn't really back off of the room. Like the reality doesn't change to suit the gag. Like if there's a tableau set up, it kind of stays the same, it seems like, from panel to panel. And and when you combine that with this kind of super expressive quality, even the walk, even Donald's kind of hunched forward kind of stride, and the kids kind of panicking at their little wails that they have, or they're super excited. Like there's one, they won't just be excited, or they won't just be sour. They'll be super sour or super excited. That's really appealing. It's really it's broadly played, but there is no, the backbone of it is really strong. The kind of the fundamentals of it are really strong. You don't ever get a sense. It never takes you out of. It allows you to kind of, like you said, kind of get absorbed in the narrative, because he doesn't cheat. He doesn't just shift things around in order to emphasize a point. It almost is like he gives credence to that reality or something, that he's going to play within the rules of what he thinks he is seeing or experiencing. There's a reportage quality to it, which is kind of a fascinating way for him to go about it. So there's an integrity to the work. There's a storytelling integrity there, and the depictions that I think is super, super appealing. You're right. And almost invisible in a good way.
The commentators in the back talk often about like how things are arranged in the panel, and characters going from right to left or left to right, left to right being the direction we're reading, and sort of pushing us that way, and then facing the other way and making us stop. And I looked at the comics, and I had a little trouble grasping how he was doing, what he was doing exactly. I don't know. I mean, I'm looking at the sequence where they're skiing, and they're skiing from right to left, which is sort of odd, because that's the opposite direction we're reading, and so I'm not sure why he did it that way. That's a great
question. I don't know.
It doesn't quite fit with the idea that he's having people, having characters move in the direction that we're reading. Right.
Well, I mean, one way to read his stuff, I don't know that it's always, but you can read it in terms of eye stoppage. I mean, it's like most great cartoonists, where you get these kind of, kind of a collection of horizontal lines and vertical lines, and I either kind of rest or stop on the vertical lines, or you kind of get Donald kind of slamming into, Donald's often portrayed as kind of like this angular line, or this kind of hunched over line, kind of in motion, kind of barreling into scenes, and frequently from left to right. I'm not sure and I don't recall the skiing strip right off the top of my head, but that would be very odd for that many kind of vertical stopping points. But yeah, I mean, there's a comedic energy that you get just from the characters in a lot of these stories, where it's constantly, Donald's slamming, kind of visually slamming up against these horizontal lines, whether it's another character or a couch or a table or a chair, and that it kind of mirrors his kind of, the frustrations of his comic intensity. He's constantly running into walls in a visual sense. So yeah, I mean, I think that element is there for sure, but when he plays around with it, like in the skiing strip, I don't know. I'd have to go take a look at specifically, like what effect he gets there. In other words, I think it's as a general point, it's still a pretty solid one, but I can imagine that Barks played around with it quite a bit, because he did so many damn stories. He's going to have to vary his formula at some point, for sure.
Yeah. One point that I like that was pointed out in the notes also is in the story where they're digging up the beach looking for that ruby, when Donald's shoveling the last shovelful of sand, Barks draws the shovel so foreshortened that the business end of the shovel is right up in our faces, and it looks huge, and it just really emphasizes how tired Donald is of shoveling and how heavy that shovel must be.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That kind of distorted effect. Mm-hmm. And very often, just in terms of the movement of the panels, like he'll go to verticals, or my memory is that he would go to vertical lines, not so much to represent stoppages, but to kind of represent timelessness a little bit. Like everything goes at rest. There's no longer the movement within panels. It's just kind of a static point, which is kind of an interesting idea too. But yeah, Barks had full control of his abilities that way, I think. I think I think he got it. I mean, that guy did a lot of comics. And, he was a mature guy when he started these comics. He was born right around the turn of the century. It must have been 1900 or 1901 or 1902.
Yeah, I think 01
so
is what it says in the book.
Yeah, he would have been, in his early 40s when he started this. And comics is hard. Comics is a hard form to learn. It's a weird form. It's kind of it's full of things that don't make sense and never quite come together. So he definitely would have been, an advertisement for the kind of the mature, seasoned hand. A lot of our great comics were made by guys that were, out of their careers, which is always kind of one of the frustrating things about current mainstream production is that a lot of the time the younger guys were favored, or younger, kind of new, fresh visual styles are favored, whereas the intricacies of cartooning, whether it's a Jack Kirby in his early 40s creating the Marvel Universe, or co-creating the Marvel Universe, or whether it's Barks kind of going on this amazing run of character creation and adventure stories in his late 40s, where, the skill set is kind of very important to executing what these stories are. And another nice thing to have all these stories in one place is that it does kind of underline execution, which I always think is a big thing, just kind of in general, the way we process comics. I always blame Stan Lee for this, because I blame Stan Lee for everything. But one of the things I think is interesting about Stan's story as it became a dominant story in comics was that he wanted to be a Hollywood screenwriter, so he often favored a narrative by which his accomplishments were seen as character creation, or working on these concepts that he could then hire himself out to Hollywood to be a character concept guy. And so we often see what comics do is kind of creating characters, which is one thing they do. But a lot of the great stories, whether like these Bark stories or those Marvel stories, or anything, take your pick, whether it's a Crumb story or a Dave Sim Cerebus story. A lot of it comes down to execution and how good the story is and how well it works on the page and how great they are kind of as comic stories, not as they are kind of vehicles for generic intellectual property creation, as much as that's where the profits are. So it's kind of great to have all these well-executed comics under one volume, so you can kind of look at what it's like to have someone, working at the top of his game and how that kind of changes everything a little bit. So it's a kind of celebration of effectively done comics, which, as opposed to the character find of the century or whatever. So I like that element too, a lot about these books.
Mm-hmm. Kumar, did you have any other points about the art?
Do you guys like the coloring? I mean, it was kind of
because this is always controversial, right?
Yeah.
The recoloring, for some reason, it always comes up with Carl Barks comics. I'm no connoisseur, and I'm mostly colorblind, so I kind of didn't. I thought I didn't have any issues. I didn't know what I was supposed to like or dislike about the colors, or how they'd been changed or what. They just seemed fine to me. They seemed to pop off the page.
My understanding what they've done is they've kind of recolored them according to the original comic books. And Rich Tommaso, the alternative comics artist, that's his kind of day gig now, is kind of working on the colors for these comics and selecting things out. And he does have some leeway to kind of make some idiosyncratic color choices, but he is kind of sticking to the original palette.
Yeah, I have the Comics Journal review of this book in front of me. It says that Gary Groth, who edited the book, has said... the principle is to reproduce as closely as possible the coloring of the original comic books, with changes made to the work only in case of obvious errors, as well as when we thought we could improve it or for the sake of consistency, and when we knew Barks disliked the coloring. They recolored it mostly the same. I guess there have been a lot of complaints about the yellows, that they look too bold or something.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's such a refined fandom that there were bound to be complaints about something. I mean, I think those things are. Like, I'm not colorblind, but I don't have, the most rigorous aesthetic when it comes to color. I talked to James Kachalka, and James Kachalka had, very specific, complaints about different coloring things, and I just looked at him like he was crazy. It just seemed like, like I love James, but it just seemed like it just wasn't something that I would ever even notice. Like if some section was colored along with the section next to it or something like that. So yeah, it's a tremendous undertaking, but I do know I just thought it was worth mentioning just because I know that people kind of went after it. What you mentioned that they're kind of, and using Barks as a key too, is kind of an element of these books overall. Just the fact that we get lost in the Andes first, it's not just the fact that it's a good choice, but it was also a favorite of Barks, maybe his favorite, even though he would mention 3 or 4 different comics as favorites, depending on the context of the interview. And so I like the fact that these books are solicitous towards Barks' vision of what those comics meant. So if they can, do some color corrections or change some things in order to make it closer to his vision, I think that's a nice thing because, like we said, these guys weren't really paid much attention to, let alone creatively catered to in all circumstances, except perhaps being left alone if they were really good at their jobs. So for that to be an element of it, I think is a nice thing.
Yeah. Personally, I don't have, of course, the originals here to compare it to, but I think the colors look fine for what they are. And
spend a couple $1 million and get those books and make a comparison and get back to us.
Right. Okay, I'll get right on that. But also, of course, the modern process of printing color comics is a lot better than it was then, and the registration is perfect, and the colors are nice and bright, and they don't look, so kind of spotty. So, I don't see any problem with recoloring them to fit the printing processes we have now.
Yeah, and I think that there's a real desire for these books, and I don't know that it's from Fantagraphics end, but I'm pretty sure it's from the Disney end, to kind of present these stories for the first time to readers that this will be their exposure to Barks. That's always an element of the dialogue about color in reprints of comics. What's your obligation to kind of represent these comics as they were originally presented, these kind of books as a historical document. Mm-hmm. And there's so many reprints being done, and so you see guys going back and forth on that. But I think, Fana, and I'm sure that this was from Disney too, they want to have books that they can kind of stock in their bookstores and bookstores more generally, and for that kind of extended, that kind of passionate fan that there's our kids that want to read this stuff, even that there's a way for them, it's more important that it communicate to them than it be loyal to some past publication, if that makes any sense. So I think that's part of their publishing mission too, is to kind of present these stories for the first time to readers that haven't read them yet. And that's kind of an interesting thing that Fan is doing generally. So they're doing those EC reprints, those black and white reprints, in kind of the same way, where it's not so much the capture of the historical record. If you don't have color, you're not capturing the EC historical record as much, in the order of it, they're presenting those books as artist books, but it's more about presenting this to people that haven't read it yet, which is a fascinating thing to think about in terms of we're really starting to get a turnover in comics that a true turnover of people that don't have a memory of this stuff, and that people that will only experience this stuff for the first time in these reprint editions. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's terribly interesting, and I'm sure that's part of it. I'm sure that's part of why the coloring, it's the best coloring to give a right now version of these books.
One other point I wanted to make, and this is mentioned by a couple of the commentators also, it's interesting. The time period when these came out, 1948-49, is just as things are starting to change after World War II with it talks about the beginning of youth consumers, and Toys R Us has just opened. I didn't realize it went back that far. And the kinds of toys that are being marketed to kids are changing, and there's more corporate pushed type of stuff, and also TV is just coming in, and there's a comic in here, one of the gag strips about watching TV, which could have, the way the gag goes, it could have been done at any period since 1949 because it still works perfectly with the kids fighting over, fighting while watching TV. So it's just interesting to kind of see the sociological things of the time reflected in here. Yeah.
And one of the reasons that the Duck comics are so loved in Europe too is the historical accident of the fact that these comics came along at a point, and they were kind of visual culture at a point at which Europe was devastated and didn't, from World War II, and didn't have a lot of opportunities to consume visual culture, and certainly not the same opportunities that a country like the United States, where there wasn't that kind of devastation to the infrastructure and to the where television kind of got a foothold quicker and movies were more plentifully seen. The affection that Europeans have had for the Duck comics and for Disney comics more generally has to do with them filling a void for visual culture due to them being so good and so kind of ubiquitous at a time when that was really just about it for a generation of kids kind of desiring to see their entertainment as well as read it. So, there's all sorts of interesting stuff going on there in the late 40s that kind of established their reputation. And you're right, that television gag comic is pretty funny and pretty timeless.
Yes.
Yeah, so the more things change, I guess.
Mm-hmm. The only other thing I had to say is there was a great quote of Barks in the introduction where he says that comic book stories are plays performed upon a gigantic stage that readers hold in their hands. And he really used them that way and had, the gigantic stage for him was really the whole planet because, he had the ducks go everywhere. But yeah, I mean, you can hold it in your hands and it really says something about how comics are kind of special.
Yeah, sure. I think that, the fact that it's a stage and that a lot of these guys, especially of Bart's generation, thought in terms of proscenia and performance in that way, that these were little tableaux. Even, early television kind of had that too with the classic sitcom setup, which looked like a stage play with, cameras perched in front of it. So you always forget that because we always think of comics as kind of like paper movies and that stuff, and there was certainly that element, guys like Eisner and stuff kind of bringing those filmic qualities to it, and the early comic book guys all fascinated by Citizen Kane and similar movies. But for the most part, a lot of these guys were stage-oriented, and that's how they kind of saw entertainment. And you're right that there's kind of it is kind of like holding a little stage play in your lap, these kind of little performances, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
They're almost like set pieces, like the television one you mentioned is a good example of that. It's something that could take place. It's like a Saturday Night Live sketch. It's kind of a single-room sketch.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to say I preferred the longer stories to the shorter ones. I think Donald has a slightly different personality, and I think the longer ones are really great, and the shorter ones are fun, but kind of low calorie. Is that the word I want to use? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. Certainly those are the ones I respond to, because those are the ones that I kind of freaked out on in reprint form in the 70s, were these longer adventure stories. But I don't know. I think rediscovering these shorter stories was kind of more fun for me because I'm not that exposed to them, as opposed to the longer stories, which have a more familiar feel to them. I'm just really glad that this stuff's coming out, actually. I just think it's really nice to have really kind of nice color volume Barks material that's really accessible, and it's not, it's not so many issues of some strange comic book or reprint form or whatever. It's kind of it's all in one place on the bookshelf, and I can access it, and that's not a bad way to spend a Saturday afternoon, kind of sucked into the Barks world of endless story.
Just dawned on me to wonder if these are going to be coming out digitally.
That's a great question. Who knows? God. Now you've made my head hurt. I don't know, and I think that the Disney licenses are pretty restricted.
Yeah.
Because they have kind of really complex licensing arrangements, and they tend to, like, for instance, I know that, like, I'm pretty sure that Fantagraphics can't sell directly to anyone overseas.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure.
Yes.
I'm sure, like,
I know that's
custom
true.
officials won't come slap, your hands if you bought one, like a Forbidden Planet or something. You wouldn't be arrested for trying to take that back to Germany or something. But I think that the licensing is restricted to the point where you just can't do that because it's a whole different set of licenses overseas. So I would bet that the Disney license is pretty restrictive as far as doing digital copies. But yeah, it's a good point. These color stories would work pretty well. They'd pop pretty well on the screen, I bet.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it certainly would qualify as something you could take around in your lap then. So Barks would be happy.
Yeah.
He'd be 113 years old now, so he might not be that happy, but he'd be a little bit happy by this. He'd probably be whipping out some paintings, to this moment if he hadn't leukemia. I think that he passed away. I'm not sure.
It wasn't old age. He was 99.
Yeah, he was one of those oldies. God bless him. And I think that's part of his enduring legend too. I think we tend to pay more attention to the guys once they reach a certain point where we can kind of have them around and kind of celebrate them a bit. And if he had died back in '67, we wouldn't have the same appreciation for Bart's stuff. Then as he kind of made this lengthy victory tour, we all got to high five him, got to meet him. That was nice. It's a good thing.
Yeah.
He is a good duck man. I like him.
Yeah.
I like that Barks.
Donald Duck Lost in the Andes is part of the Fantagraphics complete Carl Barks Disney library. This particular volume is out of print, but still available digitally from Amazon or from third parties at crazy prices. Follow us on Blue Sky at Decon Comics. On Facebook, we have both a page and a group. Those are linked from deconstructingcomics.com, as is our YouTube channel, where our episodes are posted every week as videos of a single image. You can comment on our episodes on YouTube or on our site, or drop us a line at mail@deconstructingcomics.com, or talk to us. Click the Leave a Voicemail link on the left sidebar of our site. Are you making a comic? Send it to us and we'll do a Critiquing Comics episode about it. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. The music backing the promotion of our Patreon is Change by Jazar. What's it like doing a daily newspaper comic strip? Is anybody still reading those strips in an actual newspaper? How does the writer of a strip remind readers what happened yesterday and get new readers up to speed? Next week I talk with Dan Scotty, who's currently drawing the rebooted Flash Gordon comic strip for Kingfisher Syndicate. He's a great artist who has also done comics in the traditional pamphlet format and his own original story, Lavender Jack, on Webtoon. And by the way, how the heck did Flash Gordon end up getting brought back? Dan will fill us in on all of this next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.